go to Trevor Manuel now, who's being interviewed by Ayesha Ismail just outside the studio on the Grand Parade.
So tell us, in eNCA, I was talking to Trevor earlier about the significance of this interfaith service taking place on the Grand Parade. Now, and he also recalls that it was in 1989 when Archbishop Desmond Tutu led a march from Parliament to the not to the Grand Parade, but to the City Hall. Trevor, where were you on that day with this historic march when the Archbishop also declared that we are a rainbow nation?
Hi, Ayesha. You know, that period of my life was a different period. I was languishing in Grootvlei prison in Bloemfontein when the march took place. I was detained as a result of my activities in the Defiance campaign, which, of course, the Archbishop took a very prominent role in. And I was detained 2 days after our march on the beaches at the Strand and Melkbosstrand. And so, yes, I was detained, but that period was a very difficult period because, you know, I'd spent 2 years in, came out, and then I was re-detained in September 1988. I was in for about 6 months when the Arch then approached the then President P.W. Botha to demand the release of those who were still in detention, and I was one of those, and I happened to be one of the key beneficiaries. I was amongst the first to be released in February of 1989, but, you know, as life would have it, it wasn't for very long before I was back in detention. But that was a relationship that I had with the Arch, you know. He had to kind of step up to the plate for me a number of times because we knew each other reasonably. And we knew each other from '84 when I worked in the UDF office in Khotso House, when he was the General Secretary of the SACC, our landlord, and because of the presence of the UDF, you may recall that Khotso House was later bombed. So we go back a while, but there's always been that stuff with the Arch, the ability to take a long view, the ability to take very clear decisions, to see through the consequences, and to take up the cudgels on behalf of people who he thought needed his support. And I think that's one of his enduring memories, or our enduring memories of him. It's that deep courage. And courage is not the loud voice. Courage is the ability to evaluate circumstances, to summon up something within yourself, and then to act on behalf of other people. In the same way, I mean, that he was prepared to confront groups of young people who tried to necklace a man. He was quite prepared to go to the groot crocodile, P.W. Botha, and speak about the injustice of detaining people. I'm saying it's been a lifelong mission of the Archbishop, and it's that gave him his formidable strength.
Now, I spoke to Andrew Boraine earlier, one of the former city managers here, and he was the person who granted the Archbishop the freedom of the city. But what he did say, and I wasn't aware of it, was that this was not a unanimous decision, which just goes to show how divided people were still at that time. It was in the late 90s. And you think to yourself, but how could people vote against a decision to grant Archbishop Desmond Tutu the freedom of the city?
Well, we must never delude ourselves about the fact that even in the Archbishop's defining us as a rainbow nation, the people of God, that there would have been unanimity. Even when he was appointed Archbishop of Cape Town as the first black holder of that position, there were a few thousand people who left the Anglican Church. And so, notwithstanding the role of the church, the apparent role of the church in struggle, there were individuals in the church who were unhappy because they were people who still carried deep racism within themselves. And I think these issues arise everywhere because part of what the Archbishop did through his life was to take on power and privilege. And if you take on power and privilege, you're taking away something from those who had wrongfully benefited from the circumstances. And so, of course, there are people who were deeply unhappy about his role. And his role, I liked the way in which Bishop Mpumuwana described it. He said, the Archbishop wasn't a political leader. He was a soldier for justice. He was a biblical soldier for justice. And it was that kind of role. He had to tackle what was unjust. And he tackled that injustice regardless of who was in power. One of the interactions between he and I, which happened at Kirstenbosch in about 2012, we had the same event, and he said to me, "What are you doing in that cabinet? You don't belong with those people because they are not good people." I'm saying it was an unbelievably strong statement, but it was a statement of courage that Tutu could issue to me. He knew me. It didn't help me that I have the same first name as his son. And so, Trevor, what are you doing? It wasn't minister and so on and so on. It was respectful, but it was fatherly. And I loved him and respected him for the way in which he could deal with these issues.
Now, just coming back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when I spoke to Andrew earlier as well, and remember his father was the deputy, and he was saying that during that whole process, he could see the pain and the anguish that the Archbishop went through, just listening to the pain and suffering that people went through as victims of apartheid.
That entire period, how it was going to play out, how the hearings would happen, and what would happen to these commissioners, because every single day they had to recount the deep pain and hurt and loss of individuals, and their job was to listen, to support, to counsel, and in order to do that, to be counseled. But I think one of the most striking images of the TRC, and it may have been in those first hearings in the East London City Hall, where one of the first witnesses was Comrade Malgas, who had been so badly tortured that the Archbishop broke down and wept. And I think that gave form and character to the TRC, because the Arch himself reflected on the fact that he couldn't break down and weep every day. He needed a different kind of courage, a different kind of engagement. He needed to be there and as a counsel, because what was very important of the TRC was that the victims, and frequently the families of victims, needed to feel that this was a process running out. And I've heard people like the late Alex Borain saying it was a process about reconciliation more than about justice. Justice was confined to those who had not sought amnesty. And that process, unfortunately, is still incomplete, because there were people who were clearly the perpetrators of the most unspeakable kind of violence, who chose not to seek amnesty and who are still walking about. And hopefully that process can be completed even in the context of the passing of the Arch.
And as the Arch always used to say, there can be no peace without justice. And Trevor, thank you so much for your time, for talking to us. And that was Trevor Manuel, an anti-apartheid veteran, a leader of the United Democratic Front, and the longest-serving finance minister in the world.